There's something curiously eternal about the way we gather around food. Whether it's medieval peasants huddled beside a smoky hearth, or modern folks crowding the glowing hum of a fridge at 2 a.m., something primal endures. And while we like to think our table manners and eating habits are gallantly evolved, I regret to inform you that many of us still dine like 14th century villagers, with significantly more Wi-Fi, but not much else changed. Take the humble spoon, for example. Or should I say, the knight's favourite portable ladle. In the Middle Ages, carrying your own spoon was not just practical, it was personal. A good spoon was like a loyal squire, always at your side. You might hang it from your belt, tuck it into your boot, or, if you were fancy, have a little pouch for it. Forget forks. They didn't gain popular trust until pasta started going mainstream in the 16th century. Until then, it was all spoons and fingers, with a dagger now and then for a tough ham hock. And yes, eating with your hands wasn't just for the unwashed masses. Even high-ranking nobles helped themselves with what God gave them, 5-fingered cutlery. Proper etiquette insisted you only use the first 3 fingers of each hand, just enough dignity to remind the table you are not, in fact, a barnyard animal. But still, everything from roast goose to greased fig tarts passed through fingers before mouths. So next time you're sneaking fries from the bottom of the bag with a casual hand dig, just know you're part of a proud tradition. Then there's the bread. Oh, the bread. Not the fluffy, pre-sliced supermarket kind, but trenchers. Thick slabs of day-old bread used as edible plates. Picture it, your stew, ladled lovingly onto a dry hunk of sourdough, slowly soaking up all the tasty drippings. At the end of the meal, you could eat it, give it to the poor, or toss it to the dogs, depending on your outlook and leftovers. These hearty squares were soaked with flavour and social implications. To eat your trencher was fine. To eat someone else's was, well, a bold move, unless you were married to them. And speaking of marriage, we come to the institution of communal dining, where table manners were tests of character. Elbows off the table. That wasn't just about space. The medieval table was long, narrow, and crowded. A stray elbow could mean a knock into the bishop's goblet, or the baron's oregano. And let me assure you, neither consequence is good. People were judged by how they handled their soup, passed the salt, and whether they picked meat from their teeth with the tip of a knife. Subtlety was encouraged. Everyone knew you'd do it. It was just a matter of style. Now consider our age-old nemesis, the dinner bell, or rather, in medieval times, the church bell. Life ran largely to the rhythm of bells, from dawn prayers to dusk suppers. Monastic communities, particularly those Benedictine types, were the original meal preppers. Strict, meal times, silent eating, and absolutely no snacking between vespers and matins. If you were caught gnawing dried figs under your robe, you could find yourself on confessional duty for weeks. Interestingly, modern schedules, especially school bells and lunch breaks, owe their precision to these monastic rhythms. Every time your phone buzzes to remind you to hydrate or eat lunch, doff your cap to Brother Godfrey and his rigid sense of caloric timing. And let's not forget the strange hold that porridge had, and still has, on the human imagination. A mixture of oats, water, and whatever else was lying around. Porridge was the great equalizer. Lords and labourers alike consumed it, though nobles might spice theirs with a dusting of cinnamon or an opportunistic raisin. Today we call it oatmeal, dress it with chia and Instagram filters, but the soul of porridge endures. A slow, simmering, slightly beige comfort. Through it all, eating was rarely a solo act. Meals were about proximity, presence, and a certain amount of performative chewing. Much like today's dinner parties, meals were battlegrounds of social hierarchy, fashion, and gossip. The seating chart alone could end marriages or start battles. Sitting near the lord of the manor meant you might get fresh fruit. Too far down, stale ale and slim pickings. So yes, we still eat like this, with our hands ever hovering, our soup slurped with grave seriousness, and our ancient hunger wrapped in ritual. We eat to nourish, yes, but also to belong. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now close your eyes if they still happen to be open, and let's wander deeper into the wondrous world of things that never truly changed. In the quiet hush of the medieval Great Hall, crackling torches threw long shadows across stone walls, and the clatter of wooden trenchers filled the air like a percussion symphony played by overeager squirrels. Yet amid the ruckus, one timeless ritual quietly unfolded: the breaking of bread. Yes, actual bread, not murder mysteries or complicated metaphors, just slightly stale, frequently chewy, probably half-charred loaves of bread, sanctified by tradition, hunger, and the general absence of cutlery. You see, in those long ago centuries, before anyone had invented the term fine dining, or really dining table, bread served a more noble purpose than just being an edible carbohydrate. It served as the plate itself. That's right. The medieval mind, unburdened by the expectations of modern plating aesthetics, looked at a slice of week-old sourdough and thought, yes, this shall bear my stew. These plate-like loaf slabs were called trenchers. Unlike today's sourdoughs nestled gently on a linen napkin next to a side of herb butter, these were tough, square-ish, and built like the brick of a small fortress. When mealtime came, stew or roasted meat was heaped straight onto the bread. After you'd scooped up your portion and tried to ignore the fact that your neighbor's elbows held a disturbing closeness to your food, the sauce-soaked trencher might either be eaten with a respectable grunt of satisfaction, or, if you were a noble soul or simply too full, donated to the local poor or dogs with social aspirations. Oddly enough, the idea of eating directly off bread still lingers. Take, for example, the humble open-faced sandwich. Popular across Scandinavia, gold standard in deli counters, and making frequent appearances at awkward brunches where someone forgot to bring plates. This culinary cousin of the trencher persists. We may now smear avocado and drape smoked salmon delicately atop it, but make no mistake, the toast beneath is just a slightly more photogenic medieval platter. Another curious holdover: the sacred geometry of shared food. Picture this: a long medieval table where everyone dug into the same dish. Personal plates still centuries away from regular use. Now fast forward to that hot skillet of nachos at your local pub. Technically, you're sharing, but spiritually, you're each engaged in holy warfare over the one chip, with just the right ratio of cheese, beans, and dignity. Medieval diners were particular about hierarchy, not hygiene. Dining was a performance, a ritual, and sometimes a survival strategy. Who you sat next to could determine your access to the meatier stew, or whether your trencher saw sauce or simply sorrow. The host sat at the top of the table, quite literally the high table, elevated above the rest to gaze serenely down across the wobbly goblets and uneven beards of guests. Seating order mattered terribly. People were placed according to rank, age, and how much poetry they could pretend to enjoy while chewing with their mouths open. Today's wedding seating charts and very competitive Thanksgiving dinner arrangements echo something eerily familiar. Why does Aunt Margaret always get the chair closest to the roast turkey and not you? Because, like in medieval times, we cannot escape the tyranny of the high table, now cleverly disguised as where the light is better for photos. Even napkins, yes, humble, crumpled, ketchup-stained napkins, have deeply medieval roots. Back then, people didn't always use separate cloths. Instead, they wiped their fingers, faces, and probably small disasters onto the long tablecloth itself, or on the hems of their own sleeves. Over time, individual linen napkins emerged, mostly for the noble and daintily disposed. Today, we carry on the tradition, though with less lace and significantly more paper folding at fast food counters. And then, there's the food line. Buffets, which we often associate with overly ambitious brunches or choosing between 17 kinds of shrimp, were conceptually seeded in the medieval practice of putting foods out according to rank. You didn't always serve everything all at once. Sometimes a lavish banquet might be staged in acts, much like onion rings after the appetizers, but before the regret set in. Which brings us, gently, to the question of utensils, or rather, their conspicuous absence. Because as the flickering candles cast soft circles across the stone hearths, and someone in a corner quietly gnawed meat with their hands, while attempting a polite conversation, the medieval diner didn't reach for a fork. And that, dear listener, is where our tale leans slightly forward, toward the mysterious journey of medieval cutlery, or lack thereof. If you've ever left a dinner party confused by which fork to use, take heart. In medieval Europe, the solution was far simpler. You didn't need a fork. You probably didn't have one. In fact, you might have been politely scolded for even suggesting such a dainty implement. Hands were, quite literally, the tools of the trade. Let's dim the torches and step into a warm, wood-panelled great hall, somewhere between the 12th and 14th centuries. Long trestle tables stretch from fireplace to door, where flickering candlelight dances on trenchers and mead goblets. There's no "you are here" sign, but trust me, you're seated where the bread plate should be. Because in these early feasts, the bread was the plate. Trenchers, as they were charmingly called, were thick slabs of stale bread, so stale in fact that they were good for little else than holding your food. Not quite sourdough, not quite roof tile. Diners would ladle hefty helpings of stew or meat onto the bread plate, let it soak up the juices, and then either eat it themselves, if they were feeling frugal or particularly lullabied by wine, or give it to the poor waiting outside the banquet hall. Yes, a kind of charitable leftovers program, medieval style. And here's where things get interesting. Start looking closely at a modern dinner table, and you'll notice echoes of this medieval mystery meal. Plates of bread offered before your steak arrives, or perhaps a fashionable open-faced sandwich dripping attractively into the palm of your hand, like a 14th century peasant's dream. Even the term upper crust, which we now reserve for the rich and fancy, originally referred to the fresher, less handled part of the bread loaf. In other words, the safest piece served to nobility. The lower crust, well, that's what you gave the poor, or your cousin Alan if he was late. Of course, chewing on a hunk of dry barley bread isn't the most glamorous part of historic dining, but medieval banquets loved ceremony, and many customs were, perhaps unintentionally, the ancestors of habits we still muddle through today. Napkin placement, for example. Contrary to modern fussiness about lap or left side, folks in the Middle Ages often just used a communal cloth draped across the top of the table. That's right. One big napkin for everyone. Talk about trusting your dinner companions. You dabbed politely, ideally avoiding your neighbor's gravy splotch, and continued chewing as if finger smudging were the height of civility. But nothing illustrates the medieval dining experience quite like the seating arrangement. Here, the phrase, breaking bread together, had its social protocols engraved in wheat. At the high table sat the lord or lady of the manor, along with the most important guests, usually positioned so the fireplace warmed their backs and the entertainment, possibly a lute player or juggler of questionable enthusiasm, sat within comfortable earshot. Lower status guests sat further away, not just geographically down the table, but down the hierarchy of who got served first, who got the better cut of meat, and who didn't get onion in their pottage. These gradations of hospitality still linger, albeit subtly. Think of wedding receptions or office break rooms, where certain people always gravitate to the good seats or get served before the boss arrives. A medieval courtier would find this perfectly familiar and would have absolutely stolen the cupcakes. Of course, no proper feast went without drinking, usually ale or wine, sometimes watered for the weak-hearted, rarely chilled. Water itself was often avoided in favor of fermented beverages, the logic being water could kill you, but 3 pints of yeasty beer only made your storytelling better. You'd raise your goblet in toast, not just to show camaraderie, but to demonstrate your drink wasn't poisoned. A casual clink of mugs, and suddenly, the entire table is a gaudy game of mutual trust. And yes, you toasted a lot. Each course, each story, and sometimes awkwardly, just to pass the butter. Some even argue that the clinking of glasses symbolized bringing all 5 senses into the experience of the meal, sound included. True or not, it certainly justified another round of celebratory thumping. So as we slip gently away from the candlelit feast and let the fire crackle into the quiet, you may wonder, why do we still toast? Why sit in meticulous order? Why the bread before the meal and the glass raised before the sip? The answers lie not just on the table, but in the centuries behind it, and just beyond the hall doors, waiting on the fringe of flickering candlelight. Let us tiptoe back to the tallow-lit dining halls of medieval Europe, where the real stars of the table weren't the roast peacock or the trencher bread soaked in gravy, but rather the fingers. Yes, those noble digits, the original utensils. Before forks came strutting onto the dining stage like pointy little aristocrats, most people ate with their hands. And while today we might be told to chew with our mouths closed and scolded for licking our fingers at dinner, in the medieval world, that was not only accepted, it was part of the culinary choreography. The rules, though, were delightfully specific. A well-mannered guest would use only 3 fingers of the right hand for eating, symbolizing cleanliness and restraint. Using all 5, barbaric. Medieval finger eating was a cultured art, like origami, but stickier. And speaking of stickiness, one didn't leave a table without a thoroughly medieval hand-washing ritual. Not the kind involving soap and the ABC song, but a silver ewer held by a servant who would pour fragrant rose or lavender water over your fingers into a basin, often with a towel offered afterward as lavishly as a red carpet. Medieval hygiene may have had its flaws, but when it came to your post-meal fingers, decadence abounded. Of course, this presumption of hand-eating came with a packet of unspoken rules, collectively called table manners, though the table wasn't always involved. In early medieval banquets, the table was often a glorified board on trestles, and elbows were not merely tolerated, they were practically necessary for stabilizing oneself amid the chaos of communal dining. Still, etiquette evolved. By the time nobles were comparing goose pâté recipes and flaunting goblets bigger than their sense of proportion, manuals were being written about how to behave at table. Monastic scribes, it turns out, weren't above jotting down notes on whether one should spit bones onto the floor, answer, don't, or at least aim under the table, or pick one's teeth loudly and with vigor. Another glorious no from the medieval Miss Manners. These codes of conduct filtered down through the centuries like butter through a linen sieve. Even today, echoes remain. Think about our discomfort when someone licks their fingers in polite company, or the way we ceremoniously place napkins in laps and dab our mouths with unnatural daintiness. These are medieval table habits, reshaped by time but stubbornly intact. In some deep ancestral part of us, we still remember the hall, the trenchers, the roasted boar that looks eerily judgmental. And then there's the social hierarchy of seating, a medieval dining room drama if ever there was one. Status was carved not just in stone castles, but in dinner placement. The lord sat at the high table opposite the door, an arrangement that was both symbolic and practical. He could oversee his guests and incidentally spot an assassin quickly. Head of table seating survives today, though hopefully with fewer daggers involved. The low table at the other end of the hall was for lesser folk. If you were invited to the feast but found yourself near the kitchen door, scraping the last smear of mustard from a honey-spattered trencher, well, you had your answer about your social rank. Interestingly, some of these dynamics still linger at weddings and holiday dinners. There's always a table for cousins, or that end chair in the dining room that no one wants but someone has to take. Our modern seating plans may be less about feudal pecking, order, and more about avoiding Aunt Margaret's political monologues, but the idea of tables reflecting relationships, thoroughly medieval. Drink, too, played its scripted part at the feast. To toast someone in the Middle Ages wasn't just a brief clink and a sip of Prosecco. It was a whole performance. You might stand, raise your goblet, and proclaim your loyalties or your liver's undying resilience to yet another round of mead. And when someone offered you a drink, say a spiced wine, you were expected to reciprocate. The entire feast might become a boozy game of I honour thee more, with goblets going back and forth like medieval ping-pong until someone fell under the table or proposed marriage to a candle holder. All these customs, once born of survival and symbolism, burrowed into our habits. These days, the candle holder remains unmolested, but we still raise glasses in toasts, observe mysterious napkin rituals, and worry, even now, about sitting at the wrong end of the table. And perhaps most delightfully, we've never quite shaken the idea that dinner is theatre, a chance not merely to eat, but to perform belonging. But of course, medieval dining wasn't all finger-licking and goblet clinking. Soon, we must turn our saucy gaze upon the curious case of leftovers, where they went, who got them, and why the poor might have longed for a scorched onion skin. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval hall, the trenchers sat waiting. Thick slices of yesterday's bread, slightly crusty, generously stale, and wholly underappreciated by modern cutlery enthusiasts. These edible plates were the unsung multitaskers of the feasting world. Part serving dish, part sponge, part makeshift napkin, and eventually, if you were lucky, part of the second course. Because nothing says luxury quite like your stew-soaked bowl being tomorrow's breakfast. You see, before the world was blessed with an oversupply of dishwasher-safe porcelain, the medieval kitchen leaned on the simplicity of sturdy carbs. The trencher, named with all the poetry of a rock, carried the main course and some of the story too. Often, after a grand meal, they'd be given to the poor, a humble form of charity perhaps, but also a clever way to avoid sticky cleanup. Here, peasant, enjoy the remnants of Sir Walter's venison pie. Medieval recycling at its finest. And while modern dining tables rarely feature loaf-based crockery, the spirit of the trencher lingers. At every summer barbecue where someone uses bread to mop up sauce, or in those diner breakfasts where an egg perches nobly atop toast, the ghost of the trencher grins approvingly. Bread, it seems, was always meant to carry more than just butter. But let's drift our gaze from the edible plates and take a moment to appreciate their unruly cousin, the spoon. It might surprise you that in the days of chivalry and questionable plumbing, most folks owned their own spoon and carried it with them. Yes, if utensils had a subconscious, spoons would have anxiety about abandonment. Forks were still regarded with suspicion, knives were commonly shared, but a man's spoon, that was personal. Dining in the Middle Ages, especially among nobility, was a surprising blend of elegance and utter chaos. Picture this. You're at a grand feast. Roasted birds are flying in faster than gossip, and someone's hound has just trotted under the table with an entire rabbit in his jaws. Amidst this carnival of flavors and furs, you reach into your belt pouch and pull out your trusty spoon, worn smooth from loyal service. There was a certain pride in one's utensil. Wealthy folks even commissioned elaborate spoons made of silver or bone, sometimes bearing religious inscriptions, or, if you were particularly fabulous, a tiny engraving of your face. The original selfie spoon, if you will. And let's not forget the ceremony of washing hands before and after eating, though not always during. A basin would be passed around, and guests would wash under the watchful eye of the steward. It was more of a polite performance than a hygiene breakthrough, like a medieval version of "I did wash, I promise." The truly devout even blessed their hands before touching food, on the off chance that holiness might neutralize that questionable mutton. But here's the twist that continues to ripple gently through time. Communal eating. Back then, one dish often served several people. The concept of a plate to yourself was as modern as Wi-Fi. You and your table mate would dive into the same bowl, ideally with coordination, though jabbing a lord's finger with your spoon probably earned you a seat closer to the stable's next meal. Somehow, in all its messiness and merriment, that communal spirit clings to us. Fondue sets, tapas, hot pots, and potlucks, all quiet homages to a time when eating was as much about the company as the cuisine. And in quiet corners of the world, bread still abides as furniture and food. Think of naan cradling curry, or injera soaking up stew. Across centuries, across continents, we still give bread the grunt work and then devour the evidence. Maybe we haven't evolved quite as far as we think, and perhaps that's a comforting thing. So, next time you tear off a piece of baguette to mop your plate clean, or produce your own collapsible spork at a picnic like a proud knight unsheathing a blade, know that you're in the company of history, ancient habits kneaded into the humdrum of now. And as the fire crackles lower and the scent of imaginary herbs drifts through our sleepy hall of thoughts, let's wander gently further into the customs of taste and time, where even the order of nibbling held mysterious significance. Somewhere in the fragrant fog of old kitchens and crowded feasting halls, the medieval butterfinger phenomenon quietly took shape. Not confectionery, mind you, but the term could certainly apply to a dining system, so finger forward, you'd wonder if inventing forks was even worth the paperwork. Tonight, by soft candlelight and imagination, we slip ourselves into a long wooden hall, the kind with a roof so thatched it whistles at the moon. There's a roast boar on the trestle table, a veritable porcine marquee, crisped skin gleaming like lacquer. Servants bustle, distributing trenchers, small loaves or thick slices of stale bread, used not for eating, but for soaking up the juices and acting as a sort of edible plate. Yes, you heard correctly. They plated their food on bread. Imagine wiping your stew off your dinner plate with a hunk of said plate. Strangely, the medieval trenchers live on today in tiny bread-based reincarnations. Think of chili served in a hollowed-out sourdough bowl at a gastropub. The concept of food as both vessel and victim never really left us. We've just rebranded it. Less poor Gerald the scullery boy is scraping old mutton off a bread plate, and more artisanal, carbohydrate snug hug for your bisque. Dining back then was a fingers-first affair, at least for everybody who wasn't trying to impress the clergy or curry favour with a duke. Forks did exist, but using them regularly in Europe before the 11th century got you a one-way ticket to social side-eye. Heck, in some cases, forks were considered sinful, tiny metal pitchforks tempting people away from their God-given fingers. Still, people clearly wanted help with their poke and scoop situations. The knife was already a permanent +1 at the table, often brought from home. And spoons, sturdy and comforting, were favoured for porridge, pottage, or anything that sloshed. But the fork, suspicious oddity. Even so, by the late medieval period, forks began to smuggle themselves into table settings like shy introverts at a loud dinner party. The Italians were among the first to embrace them more broadly. Naturally, pasta demanded a tool of twirling prowess. Try imagining someone elegantly eating spaghetti with their hands while galloping on horseback. Not feasible. Despite early sample sizes that included dubious nobility and the occasional Venetian bishop, fork skepticism faded, though it took centuries. England didn't warm up to the fork until the 1600s, and even then, only after enough powdered wigs had concluded that gnawing goose comfit with your hands in public was no longer en vogue. And yet, medieval eating customs weren't solely governmental in nature. They were also deeply, how shall we put this, slobby. The average feast wasn't just dinner. It was part small war, part social ballet. When meat was passed around, it often went straight from knife to fingers to mouth. Napkins were unheard of in some regions, so the trend was to simply wipe one's hands, graciously, on the tablecloth, which, if you think about it, still echoes gently in modern barbecue joints, where napkins are optional but bibs are probable. In fact, the entire finger-licking phenomenon is simply a shadow of medieval dining's relaxed marriage between flesh, fire, and fingers. Think of how many foods today we still consume that way. Fried chicken, pizza slices, ribs, tacos, burgers. Entire industries now thrive on meals meant to be held without metal barriers. There's a rugged, centuries-old charm in letting our inner villain emerge long enough to properly enjoy something crispy and dripping. Even our weirdest buffet behaviours can be traced back to grand hall feasts. When nobles called for a banquet, food was paraded out in courses, not all at once, and rarely just for sustenance. It was spectacle. Humble game birds would appear feathered, reassembled after roasting in mock flight. Pies contained live animals. This was cuisine as theatre. Modern buffets, bless them, are a leaner version of those extravagant medieval feasts, an all-you-can-eat homage to a time when presentation mattered almost as much as flavour. That 10-foot-long table of macaroni, salad and lukewarm meatballs at your cousin's third wedding reception. A crude descendant of a banquet, where the dessert may have featured a swan painted in gold leaf. Of course, not every medieval culinary idea made a graceful landing in our era. Swans, thankfully, were retired as entrees. We stopped drinking dissolved pearl dust. But the communal habits, eating with hands, relying on bread as bowls, expecting theatre at dinner, have all stayed tucked under the modern napkin. As the candles burn lower in our imaginary hall, and the scent of roasted hare wafts gently into the rafters where cats surely lurk, we see the past and present swirling together like steam off warm broth. Our customs today might be served in sanitized porcelain dishware, but their bones, greasy, sweet, and communal, are undeniably medieval. And so, with fingers gently wiped on linen, or jeans, let's be honest, let us press onward into a realm not of grease-stained trenchers or awkward fork, fumblings, but something far spicier. A pinch of salt, a touch of cumin. The spice trail is calling. Picture, if you will, a great medieval hall, timber beams overhead, candlelight flickering against cold stone walls, and at the centre, a long wooden table groaning under the weight of roasted meats, stewed fruits, crusty loaves, and suspiciously wobbly pies. A minstrel plucks something resembling a tune in the corner. Someone is loudly complaining about the lack of mustard, and the smell, oh the smell, is a fragrant symphony of garlic, game, and goat. Now, shift your gaze not to the food itself, but to the curious rituals around it, because before forks and after fingers, there was etiquette, which, surprisingly, you still follow more than you'd think. Let's begin with something deceptively simple: washing your hands. Today, it's just polite. Back then, it was practically a spiritual experience. Hand washing before meals in the Middle Ages wasn't just about hygiene. It was a ritual act of soul cleansing. Servants would appear with bowls of scented water, sometimes with rose petals floating like tiny boats, and you'd dip your hands slowly, performatively, as if trying to impress a skeptical bishop. And sure, soap was optional and rare, but the idea of entering the meal purified, that has strangely survived, even if now our ritual sinks come with grapefruit-scented foam and gentle passive aggression from public restroom signage. Now, when sitting down to eat, one didn't just plop onto any old seat. No, the seating arrangement in a medieval dinner was less musical chairs and more Game of Thrones. Hierarchy was everything. The closer you were to the salt, the more important you were. Yes, the salt. This is where the charming phrase "above the salt" comes from. If you were seated near the big ornamental salt cellar, usually centrally placed on the table, congratulations, you mattered. You probably owned land, spoke Latin, or at least knew how to properly pronounce aubergine. If you sat below the salt, well, better luck next feast. Fast forward to today, and think of the rigid order of wedding banquets or office holiday dinners. There's always that one table near the exits, suspiciously close to the kitchen door. You know, the below the salt equivalent in modern hospitality. The seating chart, it seems, never truly died. It merely got printed on slightly overpriced cardstock. Speaking of etiquette, in medieval meals, it was vital to avoid what they called breach of manners. And what counted as a breach? Oh, the usual: licking your knife, wiping your nose on the tablecloth, or, heaven forbid, double dipping. Yes, even in the 14th century, there were rules about dipping. if you plunged your bread into the communal sauce bowl more than once, you'd risk being excommunicated, or at the very least, frowned at by the fellow with the most feathers in his hat. It was also considered terribly impolite to talk with food in your mouth, to point your knife at someone, or to reach across the table. In fact, many modern table manners have roots in medieval codes of conduct. Those behavioral commandments were hammered into young squires and noble children with all the subtlety of a trebuchet. You may not realize it, but every time you delicately pass the gravy boat instead of flinging it across the table, you're basically channeling a 13th century courtier trying not to offend the Earl of Northumbria. And now, the pièce de résistance, saying grace. It wasn't just a polite opening act, it was a liturgical production. In many households, meals began and ended with prayer, not just as thanks, but as a sacred frame around the act of eating. People believed that the food and one's digestion were overseen by divine forces, and partaking in bread and ale was something akin to communion, especially when the bread was made of barley swept up from a dirt floor and the ale was only questionably fermented. Today, we still pause before meals. Some pray, some express gratitude, and others take a moment to snap a photo for social media, which is perhaps the 21st century version of invoking divine approval. But perhaps the most enduring etiquette of all was this: sharing. Most medieval diners didn't get their own individual plate. Instead, two people would share a trencher, a thick hunk of stale bread used as an edible plate. You and your dining companion would eat from the same surface, ideally without dribbling stew all over each other. This practice, curiously intimate and a bit crumbly, lives on today in the form of tapas, potlucks, and that one friend who insists that we just share everything at restaurants while commandeering the best fries. So next time you gingerly navigate a formal dinner, remembering which fork is the salad one, sharing a dish, or discreetly wiping your mouth on a napkin rather than your sleeve, the medieval code whispers through you. Table manners, it seems, didn't disappear. They merely stopped involving trenchers and the risk of gout. And as we gently place our metaphorical napkins onto our laps and prepare for the next course, we'll turn our gaze toward what came after the feast. Because in medieval times, the food was only half the story. Bread, as humble and unassuming as a crusty, flour-dusted loaf may look, is arguably the single edible thread that connects us and our medieval forebears in a warm and yeasty embrace. Of course, today, we get our daily bread pre-sliced, bagged, and often accompanied by the faint sound of pop music echoing through the supermarket's gluten-free aisle. But once upon a time, say around 1342, bread was more than food. It was plate, utensil, social class indicator, and sometimes a clue that something had gone terribly wrong in the kitchen. Let's begin with the trenchers. Not the folks digging trenches, but the edible dinnerware. That doubled as sustenance. In great halls across Europe, nobles and commoners alike placed their stews and meats on thick slabs of stale bread known as trenchers. These weren't your soft bakery loaves or warm pretzel buns. They were basically exquisite doorstops baked 3 days too long, designed more for structural integrity than flavor. Imagine hosting a dinner party and serving prime rib on a slice of week-old focaccia. It's both unfortunate and oddly efficient. Now, the brilliance of the trencher system was that it did two things. It fed you and reduced your dishwashing to zero. Once the meal was over and your trencher had soaked up all the gravy, broth, and errant turnip juice, you had 3 disposal options. 1. Eat it. 2. Pass it down the table to someone hungrier than you, like a page boy or especially bold dog. Or 3. collect them all at the end and give them to the poor. That's right. Medieval to-go boxes were bread soaked in someone else's supper. Generous, if not particularly hygienic. And while many customs from this era have, thankfully, moved on, the symbolism of bread has proven strangely immortal. Consider the bread basket at most restaurants, a gesture of hospitality that dates back to medieval table rituals. But instead of bringing guests warm sourdough rolls, your medieval host might set down a trencher and a handful of salted lard, accompanied by polite eye contact and exactly zero discussion of allergens. Then there's the medieval obsession with white bread. The paler the loaf, the higher your status. Poorer folk had to contend with rye or barley loaves, dense, dark, and occasionally flecked with surprise ingredients like bean husks, or, in especially unfortunate seasons, chalky fillers. By contrast, the elite demanded their manchet bread, a soft white delicacy made with painstakingly sifted flour. Sifting, in this context, involved actual people waving large sieves for hours as if straining the very essence of nobility from the wheat. The relentless categorizing of bread also birthed a class system of loaves. Pain de bouche, bread for your mouth, pain de ménage, bread for the household, and pain d'aloyau, bread for soaking with meats, the queen of gravy sponges. Even today you can see echoes of this culinary feudalism in how we size up breads. Ciabatta for the aspiring artisan, sliced multigrain for the sensible commuter, and sourdough for those in a long-term relationship with starter culture. Now, don't let me forget the obligatory bread etiquette. At proper medieval feasts, tearing was honored, slicing was suspect. Using a knife on bread suggested that either the loaf was poorly made, or worse, that you were French. Forks were barely on the scene yet, so polite diners would shred off bits of trenchers with their fingers, careful never to lick grease until they'd excused themselves to the wash basin or a convenient curtain. And we must mention the ultimate bread faux pas of the time, dropping your trencher on the floor. Doing so at a banquet was roughly equivalent to calling the host's grandmother a turnip, which, you'll note, was an insidious insult in culinary terms. Recovering from such a social gaffe often involved dramatic repentance, another round of mead, and pretending it never happened. All this to say, when you calmly butter your toast in the morning, you're reenacting centuries of baked history without even realizing it. You're eating what kings once scoffed and peasants once prized, but you're doing it with cleaner hands, fewer feathers in your hair, and a much lower risk of being arrested for sorcery, which I count as progress. Now, as we let our imaginations soak like gravy into a stale trencher, let's drift a bit farther down the banquet table, to the strange and surprisingly long-lived tale of medieval food waste, or rather, the inventive medieval ways to avoid it altogether. Some modern dilemmas are remarkably ancient in disguise. The bewildering etiquette of which fork to use, the age-old question of whether fingers are acceptable, and the silent primal war of whether to double dip. These are not merely dinner party anxieties. They are echoes of a much older human drama, played out long before dinner tables featured coasters, or anyone said, "Pass the artisanal aioli." To witness the origin of your very particular sandwich neuroses, we turn the candlelit dial back to medieval Europe, where the concept of a plate as something you don't eat was still, quite frankly, under development. See, in the 12th or 13th century, when knighthood was fashionable, lords had terrible haircuts, and nobody had quite figured out soap's full potential. People dined off something called a trencher. No, not a soldier from World War I. A trencher was a thick slice of stale bread, roughly the size of a modern-day dinner plate and roughly the consistency of calcified regret. This bread platter bore the weight of your meal: meat, stewed vegetables, and sauce that, let's be honest, went everywhere. Think of it as an edible plate, though not always one you actually ate. After the meal, the juice-drenched remains of the trencher were often handed over to the poor, or in some cases, the local goat. That is, if the bread hadn't already disintegrated under the siege of medieval gravy. This, by the way, is humanity's first flirtation with the all-in-one dish. And yes, if you've ever stared lovingly at your loaded nachos, caught in awe of the simple elegance of food carrying other food, you're connecting with centuries of culinary ancestry. Now, as civilization, a loose term here, advanced, trencher bread evolved into wooden platters, then pewter plates, and eventually the notion took hold that food should not soak lethargically into your tableware. But the trencher spirit, that communion of substance and serving tool, remains very much alive in the form of bread, bowls, taco shells, even the humble hot dog bun. Behold our enduring love of food that cradles food. But should utensils fail you, or should you be trapdoored into a medieval tavern, it's useful to know that for most folks across the Middle Ages, fingers were the original multi-purpose cutlery. Yes, forklessness was not just tolerated, it was virtuous. Using your hands to eat was seen as honest and noble, provided you washed them, which only some people did. You would use 3 fingers to handle your meat or tear bread, while the pinky was kept daintily aloft, not in the modern tea-sipping sense, but to remain clean for wiping your lips. That's right, the medieval pinky was less a digit and more a handheld napkin. Among the upper class, manners eventually became a competitive sport. Courtiers practiced dainty bites, clean sleeves, and conspicuous hand-washing before and after meals. This ritual wasn't just sanitary, it was political theatre, a way of saying, look how clean and God-fearing my fingers are, not like those grubby peasantry paws. Speaking of peasants, they may not have had dedicated napkins, but they mastered the fine art of not getting sauce all over their everything via years of tactile trial and error. Survival-based daintiness, if you will, a skill set you, perhaps unwittingly, carry forward every time you remove the crust of your toast with surgical precision. Meanwhile, the adoption of the fork took centuries. When the fork finally squeaked into European dining in the 11th century, originally from Byzantium, it was viewed with open suspicion. Why, you ask? Because humans are, by nature, wary of pointy things. And also, because some clergy saw the fork as vanity, a tool that defied the holy usefulness of the God-given hand, impractical and heretical. Imagine thinking your salad tongs are blasphemy, but such was the era. Eventually, forks found favour, driven in large part by noblewomen who were pretty tired of stew blots on their bodices. And while it took some convincing, and maybe a few fashion casualties, the fork made its way into common use, though not entirely at the same time, and not without some showy reluctance masked as tradition. Even today, humanity wrestles with the age-old negotiation between fingers and forks. Does the burger require a knife? Is sushi permissible by hand? We overthink, and yet the medieval world lives on in every guilty French fry finger dip, and in every suspicious glance toward your cousin who uses a spoon for cake. Dining, it turns out, is not just what we eat or how we eat, but the deeply human urge to make a performance of it. And as candlelight flickers over trenches past, our minds turn now to what medieval cooks actually put on them. Strange combinations, curiously spiced chickens, and the conspicuous absence of tomatoes. But that's a flavour best savoured in our next sleepy meander through time. During a medieval feast, and, oh, there were feasts aplenty, one practice reigned supreme above etiquette, above comfort, and perhaps above common sense: communal dining. Yes, the fine art of eating elbow to elbow, shoulder to shoulder, often from one massive trencher or shared bowl. Whether you're imagining knights, noble ladies, monks, or peasants, you can bet they weren't reaching for their own personal plates. Because why have your own space when you can get intimately acquainted with your neighbour's sleeve in the soup? The trencher, the medieval predecessor to the modern plate, wasn't even a plate in the traditional sense. It was a flat slab of stale bread. Trenchers soaked up your meat juices, your gravy, the drippings of roasted pigeon, and anything else the cook flung dreamily onto the table. After the meal, you could eat your trencher, or, if you were feeling especially pious or already full of goose leg, give it to the poor. Recycling, 14th century style. Now imagine you're a guest at one of these fine dinners. You sit, if you're lucky enough to earn a spot at the table, beside someone of equal or lesser rank. That person becomes your feasting partner. There are rules to this. You share a trencher. You take turns sipping from the same goblet. You occasionally carve meat for each other, like polite, knife-wielding squirrels. And under no circumstance should you, heaven forbid, lick your fingers and put them back into the common sauce. Not unless you want a swift medieval side-eye and perhaps an altercation involving poultry bones. It might surprise you, as you shuffle under your softest blanket, that echoes of this medieval dance are still alive today. The next time you find yourself at a tapas bar, passing patatas bravas to your friends, or when the waiter places a single charcuterie board for 6 of you to politely harvest, congratulations. You've just participated in an ecclesiastically approved 14th century convivial ritual. Give yourself a metaphorical noble title. Lord of the shared appetizer, perhaps. And oh, let us not forget the spoon. In those days, the spoon was a deeply personal item. A fine spoon might be passed down through generations, tucked lovingly into travel bags alongside a spare tunic and a toothpick the size of a fencing foil. Everyone had their own, and you'd no sooner share a spoon than you would share a toothbrush today. Well, except with that one cousin who keeps showing up uninvited to every feast. You know the one. Knives were also a bring-your-own affair. Hosts, even the wealthiest, did not typically supply them, for reasons both practical and subtle. Practical, because iron was precious and tableware wasn't IKEA affordable. Subtle, because if guests didn't bring their own knives, it made spontaneous duels far more complicated, and that might ruin dessert. Also important, the knife was not just for cutting food, it was also a way of showing off. A particularly grand blade, with a carved handle or an ivory grip, said, "I come from importance," or at least, "I didn't trade 3 goats for this outfit." There's something dreamily theatrical about the way meals worked in those centuries. Hierarchy wasn't only in the seating. Those of higher rank were served better portions, better wine, and better napkins. It was in the ritual itself. Servers knelt while presenting dishes. The food was announced like it had arrived from a royal cloud. Here arrives the salted pike in saffron broth. And everyone pretended not to notice that it was probably last week's pike, dressed very convincingly for the occasion. But our modern world still carries trace minerals of this pageantry. Think of the proud waiter dramatically grating fresh truffle over your carbonara, the lifeless parsley drizzle that completes your $16 soup, or the sacred ceremony of carving turkey at Thanksgiving, which, let's be honest, is more about the wielding of cutlery than the turkey itself. We haven't shed the medieval habit of food as spectacle. We've merely dimmed the candlelight and added cameras. So as you drift off, consider this. The next time you dunk your bread into a bubbling pot of cheese at a fondue party, or reach for the communal hummus, you're participating in an epic tradition. Your ancestors might have dipped a trencher rather than a pita chip, but the spirit is the same. Cooperation, shared crumbs, maybe a mild squabble over the last pickle. And now, with your imaginary spoon tucked safely beneath your pillow and a noble title bestowed upon your dreams, let us move on to something far, far smellier, yet still strangely familiar. It might be hard to imagine that something as innocent as how we set the table could be a vestige of the medieval world. And yet, as you fluff your pillow and mentally inventory your silverware drawer, consider this. Many of the things you expect to see at a dinner table, folded, napkins, orderly utensils, perhaps a candle or two you lit to feel fancy, have their tangled roots in the long corridors and drafty great halls of feasting households centuries ago. Take, for instance, the humble napkin. Today, it's a cloth square demurely perched by the plate, ready to dab away soup spills and maybe catch a stray burrito escapee. But in the Middle Ages, things were a little messier and quite a bit more theatrical. Napkins hadn't always been a part of dining. In fact, in earlier days, guests would simply wipe their hands on the nearest available surface, which might include the edge of the tablecloth, if there was one, a dog, or their tunic. Very inclusive. Eventually, as the feasting grew more refined and ladies of court grew less tolerant of chicken grease on velvet sleeves, a custom arose called the trencher cloth. This was not, as the name might imply, a bib for swordplay, but rather a shared napkin that sat in the middle of the table, communal fabric upon which diners would graciously wipe hands between courses. So communal, in fact, that it often doubled as a communication point. Wiping delicately might indicate dignity. Smearing angrily might signal a jousting match was imminent. Decorum, after all, had its seasonal moods. The fork, that prickly newcomer, wasn't even invited to dinner in most of Europe until well after knives and spoons had retired their dancing careers along elvish banquets. For centuries, people happily dug into meals with their fingers, or with knives, which most folks were expected to bring from home, like a medieval BYOC, bring your own cutlery. Spoons were the reigning champions of medieval utensilry, treasured so deeply they were often given as godparent gifts. Congratulations on your baptism. May your porridge be ever smooth. But the fork was suspicious, unwelcome. Italian noble women had started using little two-pronged instruments to eat candied fruits without getting sticky fingers, and this was seen by some as the height of decadence or devilry. Literally. One clergyman sniffed condemningly that humans had no need of this metallic pitchfork when God had so kindly given us 5 perfectly good fingers. Imagine a sermon about table manners in which the devil is not in the details, but in the dessert fork. Nevertheless, forks eventually gained ground, mostly thanks to trade, and slinked onto European tables by the 17th century, with the discreet swagger of a misunderstood chef's tool turned status symbol. And today, we still insist on their company, often in multiple sizes, in case your asparagus gets ideas above its station. Even the way you arrange your table, dinner plate in the middle, fork to the left, knife to the right with the blade facing in, spoon lingering just above like a watchful elf. This all has echoes of medieval etiquette that became fossilized into gentility by the Elizabethan era. Why does the knife face inward? It's a legacy of trust. Turning the blade outward would have been seen, at one time, as an aggressive posture. So next time you set the table, know you're not just arranging utensils, you're pledging peace. And then, there are the salt cellars. Ah, the salt cellar, the original table bling. Salt was once so valuable, it practically had its own throne at dinner. At banquets, a large and often ornate salt cellar would be placed at the head table, near the host. Sitting above the salt, close to this gilded condiment monument, was a mark of high status. Guests of lesser importance were seated further down the table, below the salt, which, in today's terms, would be like being seated near the kitchen door at a wedding, only much saltier. Today, while we've traded elaborate salt vessels for shakers they sell in twin packs at the grocery store, the ritual remains. Salt still waits center stage at the table, ready to anoint the meal with its humble magic, and we still, somehow instinctively, pass it to the left. Or is it the right? Ah well. Forks may come and go, but the dance of salt lingers on. And just ahead, in the soft flicker of torchlight and Sunday roasts, lies the curious tale of how we measure meals not by joy alone, but by course. In the hush of a flickering torchlit hall, somewhere between the chicken subtly roasted over a smoky log fire and the unsettling sight of an eel custard, lies one of the more quietly enduring customs of medieval dining, the reverent use of the grace period, that charming little moment of stillness before a meal begins. Today, we might call it saying grace, a blessing before eating, but back in medieval times, this moment was a fully choreographed ritual designed not only to honor God, but also, rather practically, to remind everyone to behave themselves before digging into the communal meat trench. Yes, we said meat trench, but we'll get there. In noble halls, the grace wasn't simply mumbled. Oh no, it was often sung, echoing through heavy wooden rafters by robed clerics, while the food steamed just out of reach. We're talking full-throated Latin-infused blessings, complete with the kind of vowels you could nap inside. It was part prayer, part etiquette drill. You were supposed to wait, hands demure, eyes down or modestly closed. A medieval version of phone down, let's be present, but with more robes, fewer forks, and absolutely zero Wi-Fi. And speaking of utensils, or rather the conspicuous lack thereof, this is where things get both fascinating and finger-lickingly odd. For much of the Middle Ages, the communal spoon played a lead role. Wooden, worn, passed along like a torch between users. The fork, suspiciously foreign, wickedly pronged, not to be trusted. You could almost hear the nobles muttering, "What sorcery is this? A dagger for peas." You see, in 11th century Europe, using a fork was borderline, scandalous. The Byzantines had them first. Of course they did, draped as they were in silk and casual opulence. But when a Byzantine princess married into Italian nobility and tried to bring her dainty eating forks with her, the scandal echoed louder than a drunk monk in Lent. Why, people wondered, would anyone want to eat with tiny pitchforks when God gave us fingers? Let's be honest, they had a point, and God definitely didn't invent salad. Enter the trencher. Today, it sounds like a piece of construction equipment. Back then, it was your plate, but not porcelain or pewter or even wood. Often, it was bread. A thick, flat slice of stale bread that served nobly as both dish and afterward, peasant takeaway. For the wealthy, trenchers soaked in meat juices would be graciously bundled and given to the poor. Nothing quite says Christian charity like, "Here you go, my child, a soggy loaf soaked with noble dripping." By now, you might be wondering, was anything not soaked in drippings? Ah, dear listener, welcome to medieval sauce culture. They were absolutely mad for sauces, clove heavy, vinegar sharp, and possibly invented as a bold culinary cover-up for meat that had been alive when the moon was new. Common recipes called for anything from sour grapes to cinnamon to stale ale, crushed almonds, and a hint, just a hint, of something fermented. You'll note that refrigeration had not yet RSVP'd to the 12th century. But perhaps the most enduring influence, the practice that has tiptoed into our modern mealtimes like a culinary ghost, is the expectation of structure. Even today, we unconsciously reflect the medieval table hierarchy. The idea that the host sits at the head of the table, pure Middle Ages. Back then, the Lord would sit at the high table, literally elevated on a platform, flanked by important guests like the bishop or the guy who owned 2 oxen instead of 1. Everyone else arranged themselves lower in both geography and significance. Social pecking order served with trenchers. This order dictated who was served first, who got the best cuts, and, crucially, who had to pretend to enjoy the fish stew. One could not rise for the restroom without acknowledging the steward. Yes, really. There were unspoken rules around bodily functions, spillage, laughter, even musical accompaniment. A harpist might play while courses were served. Imagine that, soup arriving with background lute. Frankly, we've undersold the lutenists. Silent, melodic food influences from a simpler time. So the next time you instinctively wait for everyone to be served before eating, or glance at your friend across the dinner table and smile politely before lifting your fork, yes, we accept forks now. Know that you are part of a long, sometimes messy, occasionally moldy tradition. A ritual of restraint before revelry, a nod to grace before gravy. As the hall grows quiet, the torch is golden and low. We prepare to uncover the next morsel, one garnished not in herbs, but in heraldry. If you've ever rolled up at a dinner party with your hands freshly scrubbed and ready to devour mini quiches with your bare fingers, congratulations. You'd fit right in at a 14th century feast. In fact, the practice of eating with your hands, far from being a quirky modern indulgence or a food truck festival accident, has royal roots and surprisingly refined etiquette. Medieval diners didn't just paw at food like enthusiastic raccoons at a picnic. Oh no. There was method, decorum, even finger choreography. The upper classes would approach their meal with precisely 2 fingers and a thumb. The middle and pointer fingers, mind you, delicately pinching and lifting morsels as if auditioning for the world's most aristocratic puppet show. But before you imagine a roomful of nobles eating roast swan with dainty pincer grips, let's pause for a wash. Hand washing wasn't just encouraged, it was the prelude to dinner theatre. Servants approached each guest with warm water bowls and towels, sometimes infused with rosewater, lemon, or herbs. This wasn't just to cleanse, it was ceremonial. The medieval signal for the mood is now dinner. Interestingly, hand washing as a pre-dinner ritual stayed with us long after the idea of brushing a whole pig with honey went out of vogue. To this day, certain traditional meals across the globe, from the Indian thali to the Ethiopian injera spread, invite us to eat with our hands, always starting with a polite wash. It's the past reminding us, gently and fragrantly, that hygiene is a whole vibe. Now imagine you are at one of these medieval banquets. You're seated on a bench, because chairs were scandalously luxurious, at a long, creaky trestle table. Before you, a slab of stale bread. Not to eat, mind you. This is your plate. Called a trencher, it caught all the bits of meat, gravy, and ambition that spilled from your hand to your board. And after the feast, once your bread plate had been sufficiently saturated with duck juice and your social standing reaffirmed, it wouldn't be discarded. No, excess trenchers were often collected and handed to the poor, which was equal parts charity and please take this soggy bread off our hands. And as for those hands, greasy from roast duck, possibly stained with berry tarts, still reeking of garlic sauce thick enough to butter a door frame, they were often wiped directly on the tablecloth. Sometimes belts, sometimes dogs. Truly, etiquette was not so much about cleanliness as it was about knowing exactly where you were allowed to be messy. You might be wondering, when did cutlery show up to ruin all this finger food fun? Knives made guest appearances first, but personal knives, you brought your own. Like a medieval gentleman pulling out his monogrammed blade at dinner, letting everyone know his intentions were honourable and his roast boar slicing technique was precise. Spoons tiptoed into the picture next, mostly for slurping pottage or desserts that threatened to cascade off fingers. But forks? Oh, forks were suspicious little prongs, often seen as extravagant or effeminate. In fact, when they appeared in Venetian courts in the 11th century, church leaders accused them of being excessively luxurious, a term medieval priests also applied to dancing, silk, and smiling for fun. It wasn't until the 17th century that forks became more common in Europe, and even then, only among those who had enough dessert courses to justify silverware logistics. Before that, food was a hands-on experience, literally. And this tactile intimacy with your meal somehow made the act itself more communal, more vibrant, and well, a bit more stained. Even today, we cling to remnants of that sensual dining spirit. At casual gatherings, we set aside forks and embrace sliders, wings, deviled eggs, all of which are, if we're honest, medieval finger foods in disguise. Even barbecue culture, with its emphasis on sticky fingers and licking sauces in public, is a smoky ode to a time when dinner was eaten by hand and nobody judged your gravy stains. So the next time you're delicately removing nacho cheese from your knuckles or reaching in for a second helping with fingers slightly too enthusiastic, just remember, you're not being uncouth. You're communing with history. You're paying homage to the trencher eaters, the oil-drenched aristocrats, the noble thumb and two fingers brigade. And as the candlelight flickers low in our imaginary great hall, we drift from sticky fingers to something even stickier, the curious customs surrounding medieval desserts, and the strange sweet things we still eat centuries later. Picture it, a grand medieval banquet hall, where the air carries the comforting scent of roasted meats, herbs, and just a hint of sweat from the 20 or so bodies jammed beside you along a creaking, wooden trestle table. There's laughter, clinking goblets, and a mulled wine-induced misjudgment of personal space. You glance sideways as someone dips their fist-sized hunk of bread into the communal sauce bowl, and you think, well, at least they're not double dipping. Here lies the ancestor of an enduring custom, the table setting, napkins, plates, forks, those things we take for granted when we sit down to dinner. They weren't always there, and yet, in their own roundabout way, they still reflect habits born in ages drenched with mead and mutton. First, let's meet the trencher, the medieval plate, if we can call it that, with a straight face. A trencher was typically just a thick slice of stale bread. Dinner was ladled onto it, meat juices soaking luxuriously into its sponge-like form. It was edible, disposable, shareable, and frankly, quite genius. Some folks ate the trencher once it had sufficiently absorbed the meal, a kind of post-cuisine pre-dessert. The particularly pious or full donated their soggy trenchers to the poor. Nothing says charity like a meat-soaked bread slab. If the trencher made today's plate, what served as the medieval napkin? Your sleeve, or a piece of cloth shared with your dining neighbor, part napkin, part tug of war. Individual napkins were considered, well, excessive, which makes modern napkin origami seem positively decadent. Swans. The Tudors would have simply wiped their fingers on the dog under the table. Now, before we reach for our salad forks, let's remember that in the medieval era, forks were suspicious, not just ignored, actively distrusted. Pointed pieces of metal brought to your lips. Witchcraft, surely. It wasn't until the late Middle Ages that forks began sneaking onto dining tables, smuggled in by Italian courtiers and slowly gaining acceptance. Before that, people ate with knives, personal ones, often sheathed on their belts like cutlery cowboys, and the ever-handy fingers, which were apparently exempt from suspicion. And here's a historical tidbit to nibble on. The etiquette around fingers persisted long after forks became fashionable. In polite society, one was advised to eat with only 3 fingers, the holy trinity of digits. Anything more, and you were essentially shoveling. This gave rise to a rather delicate dining dance. Fingers poised, pinkies curled, and bits of fowl daintily plucked like sacred offerings. Let's not skip over the ritual of hand washing before and after the meal. A basin of water was brought in, hands dabbled daintily, often with scented waters, and dried with damask cloths. Of course, this was mostly for show in noble households. Peasants were more likely to use the dew off a cabbage leaf or just shrug and carry on. But the concept of washing one's hands before eating, it still lingers lovingly in our modern routines, though now we have apple-scented foams and the quiet power struggle over the last paper towel. Perhaps most wonderfully persistent, however, is the notion of placing the table. Medieval meals were not served on permanent furniture. The table was literally set, wooden boards laid atop trestles with the Latin word disposere, to place, hanging in the air. Hence the phrase setting the table. Everything was transient, like a travelling show of roasted boar and cloven-footed malcontents. Decor was a big part of medieval feasting, sometimes absurdly so. Live birds pop out from pies, roasted peacocks presented in full feathered regalia, gilded meats that shimmered like dragons' hordes. You may not have theatrical poultry at your Wednesday night dinner, but garnishes, plating flourishes, birthday cakes with sparklers. We haven't strayed that far. Even the placement of the salt cellar spoke volumes in the Middle Ages. The lord of the manor sat above the salt, while lesser guests filtered below the salt, a subtle geographic burn. Fast forward to now, and the salt still sits in the center, surrounded by folklore and the universal truth that someone's always going to overshake it. So tonight, as you tuck in your napkin and rearrange your silverware in that strange order, meant for courses you're not having, remember, you're part of a centuries-old system, a dinner ritual practiced by noblemen, jesters, and slightly inebriated squires who once debated whether a fork was a devil's spade. Now, if you're sufficiently full of historical flavour, let us rise gently from the wooden bench and shuffle toward another lingering medieval mystery. What was actually in those spiced wines we keep toasting with? In the subdued hum of a sleepy medieval feast, where torches flickered against stone walls and the air smelled gently of rosemary and mutton stew, there was a sound almost as constant as the lute: slurping. Not impolite slurping, mind you. Well, perhaps a bit impolite, but hearty, contented, communal slurping. You see, everyone drank from the same cup. Yes, the communal goblet, the shared chalice, the medieval equivalent of a group text. One drink passed from hand to hand like a sacred relic, or a particularly popular garden gnome at a particularly tipsy garden party. And while you might pull a face at the idea today, this custom has tiptoed its way right into modern life, wearing different shoes but the same socks. We haven't exactly kept the passing of the communal wine goblet during dinner, unless you're at a very close-knit Renaissance fair, but the idea of sharing drinks lingers on in quieter ways. Think wedding toasts, baptismal sips, and of course the strange modern ritual in which one brave soul buys a round of shots and everyone slams them as if auditioning for a Viking raid. But back in the hushed grandeur of our medieval hall, this communal drinking wasn't just an efficient way to consume wine. It was a ritual of trust. People believed that sharing a vessel bound them together in loyalty, or at the very least, mildly exchange germs. There were real fears that a poison cup might sneak into courtly life, which gave rise to the curious custom of the cupbearer, a noble's personal beverage bodyguard, taste tester extraordinaire, and wave of the hand poison detector. If you thought sommeliers were fussy about wine temperature, imagine a medieval cupbearer sniffing your mead for traces of belladonna while side-eyeing the Duke of Nottingham. And there was etiquette involved, of course, an entire libation ballet. One did not simply gulp. You lifted, nodded, perhaps uttered a line like, "to your health," to the realm, or if you were feeling saucy, to the goose that fed us. Then a sip, a gentle swish, a satisfied sigh, and then a conscious effort not to backwash, because though nobody said it aloud, the awareness was there. It wasn't just feasting halls. Monasteries, too, used communal cups, passed quietly, around wooden tables beneath cloistered ceilings, a reminder of shared humility and the fundamentally equalizing power of warm ale. Now, fast forward to today. We don't tend to share our wine glasses with an entire banquet hall. Again, unless you've been to a very memorable wedding, but we still build these little communal rituals around food and drink, sipping from someone's mug on a cozy couch, clinking glasses at midnight, letting grandma insist you try just a small taste of something from her plate, which somehow turns into a bite-sized meal. Our love language might have evolved, but the roots still tap into that ancient wooden goblet. Amusingly enough, the medievals also gave us the toast. Yes, the speech and the literal charred bread. Before we were clinking glasses to awkwardly rehearsed best man speeches, toasting had a far crunchier role. People would drop burnt bread, often flavored with spices or herbs, into wine. It was believed to improve flavor, absorb questionable sediments, and, perhaps optimistically, ward off misfortune. So when someone proposed a toast to the king, they may have literally had a floating crust doing laps around their cup. And here's something delightfully odd. Some extremely enthusiastic hosts had drinking coaches, akin to butlers, except specializing in the well-being of your goblet. Their job was to refill your cup too often and too generously. If you were particularly unlucky, they'd sing while doing it. The act of drinking together, like breaking bread or stealing the last olive from a shared bowl, has always been layered. It was politics, piety, PSAs for poison prevention, but above all, it was togetherness, an awkward, occasionally alcoholed up togetherness that meant you belonged at the table, even if you accidentally spilled your mead on a nun. And as we drift from the clinking cups of the past into something quieter, let's not forget that our next food ritual has a surprising medieval origin too, even if these days it's something you probably keep in a drawer. The medieval dining table, despite lacking forks and consistent hand washing, was astonishingly good at engineering a good time. Among its most curiously enduring customs was a little daily ritual we now call grace. Yes, that pause before dinner when one relative inevitably forgets they were supposed to say something meaningful and instead mumbles a vague "thanks for the grub," was once a cornerstone of medieval dining decorum. But in the castles and common halls of the Middle Ages, saying grace was less about poetic phrasing and more about careful etiquette, and oddly, survival. You see, in a world without refrigeration, expired milk was sometimes also dinner, so asking a higher power to intervene between your stomach and the dubious contents of your trencher wasn't just piety, it was risk management. Now, suspend your disbelief for a moment and picture a medieval meal. Not the sanitized, dimly lit spreads from historical dramas, but the real thing. It's loud. Someone's goat is inside, for reasons no one remembers. Dogs are underfoot. There's a juggler attempting something ambitious with spoons, and standing right at the edge of this cheerful chaos, a priest or monk, muttering Latin phrases at a loaf of rye and a rather untrustworthy-looking eel. The blessing of food before eating had not just spiritual weight, but social order. Grace wasn't just for the food. It was a subtle reminder that what you had came from someplace bigger, holier, and, hopefully, less full of worms. It also neatly marked the start of the meal, kind of like an edible starting pistol. Once the amen sounded, trenchers became fair game. Interestingly, the type of grace you said might also depend on your status and stomach contents. The wealthy, whose meals involved more roasting than boiling and less suspicion overall, tended to have lengthier, more theatrical blessings. The poor, quite busy with the pressing matter of not starving, kept it brief. One whispered, "Deo gratias," and you could dive into your oatmeal in disguise. But saying grace wasn't always just a before-dinner affair. In monasteries, meals were conducted in reverent silence, except for the reciting monk, who read spiritual texts while others chewed soberly. If you've ever eaten a sandwich during a podcast about morality, you're halfway there. The act of blessing carried on and found new shapes over centuries. Even as forks finally made their dramatic European debut, the late 16th century, thank you, it remained oddly comforting to delay gratification by a few words. In cultures around the world, that moment of pause before eating never quite went away. Today, we don't always call it grace. Sometimes it's thanks, or cheers, or just a quiet moment to look affectionately at a burrito before diving in. But the essence, that pause, that breath, still clings to us. A little gap between preparation and indulgence. A tiny medieval ghost whispering, "Appreciate this," and also, "Hope it's not poisoned." Of course, the act of saluting food has wandered into its own comedic territory in recent decades. Think of the feigned solemnity before pizza arrives at sleepovers, the mock bows to takeaway containers, the ironic toast to microwaved mac and cheese. But the gesture, even dressed in sarcasm, persists. There's a strange humanity in this habit. Whether our ancestors feared divine retribution via meat pie, or simply wanted to savor a fleeting moment before the salt and vinegar disappeared, something about honoring a meal never lost its taste. And here's a particularly medieval twist: leftovers. During feasts, it was common the privileged few ate from the top layer of a dish, while the lower crusts, the scraps, were gathered afterward and given to the poor. Some of these offcuts were blessed before redistribution, infusing even cast-off crumbs with dignity. It's a comforting thought, isn't it? That even the bits that fell through the cracks were considered worthy of grace. Maybe that's why the custom endures, not just as a blessing over dinner, but as a reminder that even the smallest portions of our days deserve acknowledgement. And as we fold our napkins, yes, those also have medieval roots, and lean back with full bellies and sleepy eyes, we prepare to drift into the cozier corners of history. Somewhere ahead, the aromas of medieval spice markets beckon. Imagine, if you will, a warm autumn evening in a countryside manor, somewhere in 14th century England. Candles flicker in iron sconces, throwing gentle shadows against stone walls, and a roast goose hangs merrily by the hearth, dripping fat that sizzles and perfumes the room. The lord of the manor reclines slightly on a carved wooden bench, while his guests pass around trenchers. Thick slices of stale bread used as edible, plates, crumbs fall, tankards clink. Someone is laughing too hard at something that wasn't that funny. The feast is underway, and despite the lack of forks, hygiene standards, and TikTok, the scene might feel oddly familiar, because tonight we muse on the curious fact that many of our modern dining habits, yes, yours and mine, and even that guy who eats cereal straight from the box, can be traced back to these long ago tables. Let's begin with the act of toasting. When we clink glasses today, some imagine it's just a polite gesture, raising a glass to good health, new beginnings, or to being halfway through another mandatory office get-together. But in the Middle Ages, a toast was laced with a bit more suspicion. Back then, raising your goblet and intentionally knocking it against someone else's wasn't just a friendly cheers. It was also a rudimentary trust exercise. If your drink happened to be poisoned, as one's was now and then, sloshing your wine into theirs ensured that if one died, both did. Suddenly, the group cheers sounds less like camaraderie and more like Hunger Games roulette. And yet, the tradition stuck, hopefully minus the poison. Then there's the curious case of the shared salt cellar. Salt, in medieval times, was worth its weight in gold, sometimes more so. A symbol of wealth and good taste, literally and socially. It was the great divider of the dinner table. High-ranking guests sat above the salt, closer to the lord and his precious salt cellar. The less fortunate found themselves below the salt, nearer to the kitchen smells and the drafty end of the hall. Today, of course, guests sit where their name cards tell them, and we merely pretend not to notice the seating hierarchy, but pass that salt too eagerly, and you might just revive an age-old power dynamic. And of course, how could we forget the ceremony of the hand wash? Before the first course was so much as sniffed, basins of warm water would be brought forth and poured over guests' hands by servants. This was less about germ theory, which hadn't yet arrived at the medieval medical conference, and more about courtly etiquette. Clean hands meant clean hearts, or at least fewer remnants of pigeon pie under your fingernails. While we no longer expect our dinner host to douse our digits with lavender-scented water, we do greet the modern cousin of this ritual at the entrance to every restaurant restroom, glowing hand dryer, and bottle of suspiciously minty sanitizer, a nod to the old custom in slightly less aristocratic packaging. And if you've ever been instructed to keep your elbows off the table, you owe that little slice of etiquette to scenes like the ones taking place in the great halls of yore. The rule had less to do with manners and more to do with the structural integrity of furniture, Medieval trestle tables were often little more than wide planks laid over loose supports. Too much leaning, elbowing, or over-exuberant gesturing, and you'd find yourself swimming in stew and tilted wine. So next time someone scolds a child for elbowing during dinner, remember, they might just be preventing a full course collapse. Even the idea of multiple courses, a light soup to start, followed by a meat dish, and then perhaps a delicate baked pear tart, has medieval roots. Medieval feasts were designed to impress, yes, but also to follow a particular rhythm. It was believed that hot, light foods should begin the meal to prime the stomach, heavier meats should follow, and cooling, sweet fruits should finish to soothe the digestion. Modern gastronomy may have dropped the humours and leeches, but we still echo that pattern in today's menus, from fast food chains to haute cuisine. So as you settle deeper into your blanket cocoon, perhaps with a snack of your own by the bedside, nothing wrong with a small midnight cheese cube, consider the oddly formal choreography of your dining table, the raising of glasses, the polite passing of condiments, the gentle resistance to putting elbows on a four-legged IKEA air. These are not just habits. They are whispers from mead-soaked halls and flickering torchlight. But what happens when the foods themselves begin to carry stories bigger than the meals? When certain ingredients rise to power like political figures in cloaks? Well, that's a tale for another course. Let's nibble into that next. Somewhere in the muffled soup of time, nestled between frescoes of saints and the yeasty musk of freshly baked trenchers, the noble art of sharing a meal took on another curious flourish. The medieval love affair with spiced wine. Now, if your brain is politely raising an eyebrow, allow me a gentle explanation. Spiced wine, or, as it was known in courtly circles, hippocras, was the Middle Ages' answer to both dessert and digestive medicine, all swirled together with enough cinnamon to make modern baristas blush. Named after Hippocrates, the Greek father of medicine, because everyone loves a scholar with a solid beard, Hippocras was 1 part beverage and 1 part metaphysical elixir. The typical recipe included red wine, honey, cinnamon, ginger, and a touch of galangal, which, if you've never encountered it, is what happens when ginger decides to wear fancier boots. This concoction was heated, steeped, strained through a manus hippocraticum, essentially a very well-behaved cloth bag, and served in shining goblets at the end of a feast. If this sounds vaguely familiar, it's because we still do it. Today we call it mulled wine, or sometimes spiced holiday regret, depending on how many mugs you've had. But back then, it was offered with a straight face and a scholarly nod, often with the added joy of tiny sweetmeats or a festive sense of medical certainty that you definitely would not get the plague after drinking it. This wasn't the only culinary custom that handled spice with such reverence. In fact, during medieval times, spices were less about flavor and more about status, digestion, and aligning your body with the cosmic temperaments of fire and air. Yes, you heard me correctly. According to humoral theory, the medieval worldview that your body was fueled by 4 fluids and pure whimsy. Spices could warm your humors and make you less melancholic. Cinnamon? Perfect for chilly, sluggish phlegm. Cloves? A divine choice for the overly sanguine. A drop of nutmeg? Well, now you're just showing off. And nothing punctuated that social ritual better than the final sip of Hippocras as twilight crept across the tapestried walls. Guests didn't guzzle it. They savoured it, or at least pretended to, while quietly wondering why their nose was tingling. Equally curious by modern standards was the pairing protocol. You might think of wine and cheese as a sacred duo, like Aristotle and logic, or naps and rainy weather. But medievalists had their own theories. They placed great faith in sweet wine with fish and spiced wine after meat. Medieval feasts, especially at the higher tables of dukes and whimsical bishops, followed a culinary logic that had little to do with the ingredients and much to do with the cosmic and philosophical balance of the meal. They weren't just feeding the stomach, you see. They were feeding the soul, preferably with a toasted fig. But Hippocras wasn't just culinary decoration. It marked a specific and intentional transition. It signaled that the heavy eating was done, and now began the quiet reflections, the softer music, and the long, meandering courtly tales told beneath candelabras that always seemed to flicker at just the right moment. Sipping Hippocras while listening to a lute was the medieval equivalent of playing ocean sounds on a sleep app, calming, slightly indulgent, and ideally leading to a nap. Today, though the recipe has changed slightly, fewer galingales for starters, the idea remains. In cold months, we warm our wine, lace it with spice, and call it festive. We gather with friends, sip slowly, and pretend we can still taste the cinnamon beneath the cheer. We might no longer strain it through a philosopher's sock, but the practice continues, whispering its ancient comforts through steam and swirling sweetness. Is it just a warm drink, or a centuries-old spell for post-dinner contentment? With your cup nearly drained, and the candlelight growing softer in the corners of the hall, let's ease quietly into another odd, enduring habit tucked into our kitchens. One involving knives, fingers, and a custom that might have you peeking suspiciously at your own hand tomorrow. Long before social media influencers tried to trick us into buttery coffee and $17 green smoothies, medieval folks were pioneering their own brand of culinary trends. Yes, long before organic was printed on everything from eggs to eyeliner, people were obsessing over food combinations with the dedication of a modern-day brunch enthusiast. And among these enduring customs, buried softly in the flowery folds of history, survives one thing we still cling to in our 21st century kitchens: the course-by-course meal. That gentle unfolding of dinner like a dramatic stage play. It may surprise your sleepy head to learn that serving food in courses, first the soup, then the meat, followed by something questionable in jelly, was a medieval movement of etiquette, controlled chaos, and possibly buttered peacocks. In the early medieval days, before forks had left their awkward teen phase and napkins were simply parts of your shirt you sighed over later, meals didn't come in courses. Instead, meals arrived all at once. A smorgasbord known as a mess, because that's exactly what it was. Imagine your entree, your dessert, your fish, your pheasant, and your carrots all betting you'd never guess which was which. Everything piled on the table like a game of hungry buffet roulette. How heartfelt. But by the 14th century, things began to change, and people started serving dishes in a more refined sequence. First this, then that. And no, you may not eat the almond tart during the broth course, unless you're the king. Then you can eat the almond tart instead of the broth, or in the bath, whatever feels mighty. This notion of orderly indulgence was both practical and performative. Nobles saw meals as theatre. To dine was to be seen dining, with deliberate pauses between acts, sometimes with music, jokes, or even surprise animal-shaped pastries. The idea was that pacing the courses allowed not just for digestion, very important, considering how much of the food had been, shall we say, ambitiously seasoned, but also for dramatic flair. If you're going to eat a whole roasted swan dressed in its own feathers, you want there to be a fanfare. The sequence often began dreamily with a sop, a warm slice of bread soaked in wine or broth, to comfort the belly and warm the soul. Then came potage, a kind of medieval stew that was either nourishing or tragic, depending on the cook's mood. After that, thick slices of roasted meat, plucked or hooved, paraded through the hall, often with sauces made from vinegar, herbs, and breadcrumbs, because gravy, as we know it, hadn't quite found itself yet. Next, there might be a subtlety. Despite what the word suggests, subtleties were anything but subtle. These were elaborate, often edible sculptures used to show off the host's status, wit, and questionable understanding of physics. They might depict mythical creatures, castles, or biblical scenes, all constructed from sugar paste, dyed almond, or dangerously dense dough. Imagine trying to survive a dinner where your dessert doubles as a building permit. And finally, just when your starch-filled limbs think they can bear no more, dessert, a concept groggy modern minds may take for granted. But in the medieval world, sweets came at the end with symbolic purpose. Sugar was expensive, exotic, and excellent at impressing guests. Little spiced wafers, candied fruits, and cheese, yes, cheese, were common finishers. And here's a sleepy twist. The idea of ending a meal with a sweet was tied to the belief that sugar aided digestion. It's not true. But who are we to challenge centuries of hopeful puddings? Interestingly, the post-battle procession of modern holiday dinners, from salad to stuffing to second helpings of pie, follows this same rhythm. And the restaurant menu, that tidy roadmap of appetizers to entrees to desserts, medieval minds would nod in satisfied agreement. Well, except perhaps at the size of the portions. A medieval banquet could feed a village. A modern tapas plate might feed someone's sense of disappointment. So, nestled in the way we serve our food today, the flattering glide of appetizers, the triumphant centerpiece, the flirtation of sweets, lingers the elegant ghost of medieval meals. We don't roast boars in our living rooms anymore, sure, but we do still believe in culinary suspense. And now, with your hunger for history, and possibly roast swan, gently sated, we drift onward to another tradition that's very much alive, even if the bread is a little less stale than it once was. Some medieval foods have vanished into the puzzling past, grains no longer grown, livestock breeds long forgotten, and pudding recipes requiring instructions like boil until suspicious. But others, well, others sit beside us quietly, lurking on supermarket shelves, smothered in cheese sauce, pretending like they didn't spend centuries bouncing between royal banquets and peasant pantries. Enter the noble nugget that is porridge. Now, I know what you're thinking. Porridge? Isn't that what bears eat in fairy tales and toddlers refuse at breakfast? Yes and no. Because for medieval Europeans, porridge wasn't just food. It was a culinary cornerstone, a hot, sludgy security blanket, possibly the oatiest expression of daily survival ever cooked over an open hearth. In fact, if you time-traveled back to the year 1182, say, to a damp little village half drowned in fog, you'd discover that breakfast, lunch, and sometimes even dinner all featured some form of mush. Oats, barley, rye. These grains were the true medieval MVPs. Ground up, boiled vigorously, and occasionally flavored with whatever vegetables or lucky rodents could be found, they became something halfway between comfort food and edible medieval glue. And through every dusty village and draughty great hall, the simplicity of porridge held firm. Rich or poor, everybody got slop. The difference was one might sprinkle it with wild honey and gooseberries, the other with, say, regret and a faint hint of turnip. Yet porridge was dearly beloved, particularly among monks, who often fasted so dramatically that a steaming bowl of barley mush felt like a ticket to indulgence. It was safe, filling, and, best of all, it didn't require teeth. A useful trait, considering dental care in the 13th century mostly involved crossing your fingers. Over time, porridge evolved in name and personality. In Scotland, it was proud, plaid, and called parritch. Thick enough to stand up a spoon. Eaten stoically 1,000 mornings in a row. In England, it sashayed into gruel, thinner and potentially tragic. And over in the Norse-ish corners of the world, it became grøt, a word best growled while wearing wool. What's remarkable is how determined porridges have been about sticking around. Even after the Renaissance, when Europe discovered spices, table forks, and the existence of flavour, porridge refused to make a discreet exit. It simply rebranded cream of wheat, polenta, grits, risotto, congee, rice pudding, oatmeal eloquently perched on Instagram, wearing slices of banana like a tiny fruit hat. The mush has endured. You may have left the medieval manna behind, but your breakfast hasn't. And it's not alone. Because while we're talking about humble staples with aggressive historical resumes, let's not forget about pie. Ah yes, pie. The great medieval Trojan horse of deliciousness. Because in the days before Tupperware or reliable refrigeration, what better way to preserve meat than encasing it in a crust thick enough to blunt a mace? Early pie crusts, known ominously as coffins, weren't meant to be eaten. They were more like edible armor. Walls of flour and lard baked rock hard to protect the steamy goodness hidden inside. You'd pry off the top like a lid, scoop out the filling, and then, if desperate, gnaw on the carapace beneath. Over time, though, we grew quite fond of the entire affair. Sweet pies filled with fruit and spices. Savoury pies packed with pigeon, eel, or, as one infamous 14th century recipe suggests, small fowl with their heads off but their feet on. Presentation mattered. Nothing says bon appétit quite like a pastry with talons. And just like porridge, pie marched onward. It adapted through every century, shape-shifting from medieval meat vault to 21st century dessert glory. There's a direct line from a 1390 banquet offering chewits of venison to your aunt's questionable attempt at cherry lattice during Thanksgiving. A flaky heritage passed chin-stained from knight to commoner to your office's pie day. So the next time you glide a spoon through your oatmeal or commit fork to custard in a sleepy midnight pie raid, just remember, you're carrying on a medieval tradition older than the fork itself. And speaking of utensils, you didn't think we always use spoons like civilized beings, did you? We're going back to fingers, trenchers, and communal bowls next, where dinner was a contact sport and bread doubled as your last course and your napkin. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We wouldn't want to surprise your dreams with too much history at once. In the quiet, flickering candlelight of a medieval great hall, you might imagine diners ladling steaming stew and spearing hunks of roast with daggers, chatter echoing off timbered ceilings, dogs waiting hopefully beneath long wooden benches. But among the many curious details of a medieval feast, there's one that quietly marched into modern dining and sat itself at the head of the table. The concept of service in courses. Yes, believe it or not, that multi-course structure that lets you alternate between feeling full and suddenly hungry all over again. It's not a modern restaurant gimmick. It's medieval, right down to its slightly theatrical sense of occasion. Back then, meals were unmistakably performative. A dinner wasn't just something you had, it was something you witnessed. The first course might appear in dramatic parade, trenchers of meat, kamas of salad, warm ale flowing like a sleepy river. Then came a pause, a lull, the medieval equivalent of Netflix buffering. And then, ding, another course would enter. This was called service à la française, though it popped up across Europe, not just in France. Entire symphonies of dishes arrived in harmonized waves. Roasted peacock, yes, feathers and all, could be marched out in company with honeyed parsnips, sugar-studded pies, and freshwater fish that had probably given up on life once they saw the cook sharpening his cleaver. And yet, from this theatrical excess, emerged some surprisingly practical things. Chief among them, the idea that meals should have beginnings, middles, and ends. Much like bedtime stories, the first course was often intended to open the stomach, which sounds like medical malpractice, but in those days meant easing the digestive system into action. Think light potages, sweetly spiced wines, perhaps something herbal to awaken the humours. Don't worry. We won't unpack that medieval medical concept right before bed. Just know it involved balancing imaginary bodily fluids and often ended with someone being bled. The middle course? That's where you flexed your feasting muscles. Roasts, stews, baked birds, and anything that attempted to bite back. Dishes rich in protein, fat, and ambition. Flavored with spices like saffron and cinnamon, which were as much a flex of your travel connections or your spice merchant's imagination as they were about flavor. This was the crescendo of your gustatory orchestra. Finally, the end. Desserts, the digestive closers. Believe it or not, they also believed in the concept of palate cleansing. A bit of candied ginger, spiced wafers, wines scented with rose or elderflower. Not only did these offer sweetness, they supposedly closed the stomach, like it was a drawbridge or a moody roommate. All this in stages, coming and going like tides against a culinary shore. And if this sounds shockingly modern, that's because it is still. The rise of fine dining in the 19th century, with all its menus, its snooty maitre d's, and forks that threaten you with small print, borrowed heavily from these earlier traditions. Even in more casual meals today, we unconsciously structure dinner around the same ancient blueprint. A little something to start, a main event to anchor us, and a sweet reward for having made it through Brussels sprouts. Even fast food joints in their own way follow the same logic. A combo meal with a starter, fries, a main, burger, and an ice cream at the buzzer. Congratulations, you've just experienced medieval structure while sitting in a drive-thru. It's worth noting that many medieval families, those not blessed with coats of arms or kitchens larger than peasant cottages, didn't experience food in courses. Meals were more of a scoop everything into one pot and pray it doesn't smell weird affair. But the tradition of the multi-phase meal didn't fade. It burrowed into culture slowly, like breadcrumbs in a doublet. What's truly remarkable is how ritualized it became. Some noblemen would have an entire staff dedicated to curating the courses. We're talking food tasters, procession coordinators, gravy specialists, the works. Today we just pressure a loved one into watching the asparagus while we frantically Google how to not overcook steak. So next time you sit down for a meal with courses, whether it's a candlelit dinner or just snacks lined up on your couch like little edible milestones, know that you're taking part in a tradition so old it outlived jousting, pointy shoes, and the notion that tomatoes were suspicious. And as the echoes of feasts long ended fade behind the trestle tables of time, we turn now to something even older. The way your daily bread got its blessing. But that's a tale best told by warm hearthlight. If you've ever instinctively passed the salt to someone at the dinner table without even thinking, or more crucially, without speaking, you've just participated in a mealtime ritual with roots so ancient, it predates indoor plumbing by several hundred years and dignity by possibly even more. Welcome to the mystifying world of medieval table etiquette, where eating was serious business and salt, surprisingly, held social rank. In the candle-lit chaos of a medieval feast, salt was not just a seasoning, it was a seating chart in mineral form. The lord of the manor, his VIP guests, and distinguished freeloaders would sit above the salt, meaning closer to the master of the house and, symbolically, closer to heaven and a strong inheritance. Meanwhile, everyone else, servants, lower nobility, or visiting poets with an unpaid invitation, sat below the salt, within easy reach of both turnips and humility. Now, to modern ears, this may sound like just another weird feudal hierarchy tradition, on par with declaring war over someone smelling of nutmeg or jousting over the last pie goose. But here's the kicker. That little modern habit of unconsciously assessing where you sit at a fancy dinner, or suddenly noticing you're closer to the kitchen than the host. Echoes of the salt line. The medieval pecking order literally carved in sodium chloride. Speaking of etiquette, let's wander deeper into dinner manners that, in some disturbingly persistent way, have wandered into modern life dressed up respectfully. Consider the dread of reaching across someone's plate, a surefire way today to earn a passive-aggressive stare, or worse, a comment about boundaries. In the Middle Ages, this infraction was more than bad manners. It was practically treasonous carnality. Reaching across someone's trencher, remember, that was their edible plate made of stale bread, could suggest you were either about to attack their portion, plague their bread with your fleas, or simply touch something sacred with unwashed hands, all of which were equally frowned upon. Hand washing before meals was also shockingly a thing. Monks were especially strict about this, often lining up for ritual hand washing, as if they were entering a sacred temple instead of a supper hall, filled with beats and psalms. Lords and ladies, too, would have ewers of water and delicate cloths brought around for cleansing. Whatever it lacked in antibacterial effectiveness, it made up for in medieval flourish. So when you see someone at a brunch buffet today spritzing sanitizer like a sommelier, waves a napkin, picture a monk clutching his linen, solemnly dripping rosewater through his fingers before diving into a meal of barley and virtue. And then there's the strange modern ritual of not talking with your mouth full, a rule so ingrained into us that even toddlers get gently corrected the moment they attempt to proclaim philosophical truths mid-chew. This too boasts medieval ancestry, though back then it wasn't about manners as much as survival. With a lack of privacy, utensils, or dental infrastructure, talking with your mouth full could result not just in spittle, but in actual projectile food. Not ideal when everyone's sitting shoulder to shoulder at a 12-foot board strewn with communal meats and open wounds. Plus, back then, you weren't eating alone. Even peasants dined as a group, passing chunks of bread, salt, and social standing, like a well-organized game of historical charades. In that environment, manners weren't simply ladylike obsessions. They were rules of engagement. If you caused a minor offense, like licking your fingers before a shared bite, you might be met with a silent glare. Or if you really crossed a line, say, double dipping into the pottage, someone might passive-aggressively offer you their own spoon. And in medieval England, that was the equivalent of subtweeting someone in 1398. But it's not all grave stares and salt-based politics. There were moments of delight too, such as the beloved custom of eating with your right hand only. Yes, the left hand, ominously dubbed the sinister hand, was considered unclean because it was usually reserved for, let's just say, other duties. So when you passed someone a dish with your right hand and they accepted it with their right hand, it was more than culinary choreography. It was an unspoken pact. Whatever happens tonight, only one of us is responsible for the gravy, and neither of us wants lice. Of course, these customs evolve. The finger bowls are now wet wipes, the trenchers are now porcelain, and instead of hand-carved bread plates, we carve artisan sourdoughs and worry aloud about gluten. But beneath all of it, every please pass the salt, every politely covered sneeze, lingers the long, breathy echo of medieval hall manners. An invisible scroll we've all been unrolling since Henry IV forgot to wash his hands. And as evening deepens and you settle more gently into the plush comfort of the present, let's quietly toddle toward one more dish, still seasoned by the Middle Ages, and still cooked exactly as it was, for better or worse. Did you know that the word banquet used to mean not food? Yes, somewhere in the cobwebbed attic of medieval semantics, banquet originally meant an after-dinner snack, much like that mischievous little square of chocolate you reach for at 10:07 p.m, pretending it's the first time you've opened the cupboard today. In fact, after the main meal, the feast, the gala, the I swear I can't eat another bite but look, more pigeon pies event, there'd be a retreat to a different room, or perhaps a canopy-covered garden, or if you were especially posh, a separate building called a banqueting house. This was where the real sugar show began. Dried fruit, candied nuts, marzipan shaped like hedgehogs. Yes, hedgehogs. Nobles never passed up an opportunity to nibble on rodents made of almond paste. But before we go nibbling along with them, let's rewind ever so slightly to one stubborn medieval food custom still hiding in plain sight today: the order and timing of meals. Let's begin with something deceptively innocent: soup. Today it's the gentlest of appetizers. It arrives in small bowls, dainty and obediently bland. But in medieval times, the first course was called potage, a thick, hearty substance somewhere between soup, stew, and did we just tip the whole vegetable garden in? It wasn't a polite beginning. It was the enduring culinary philosophy of start strong, and if possible, with bacon. And then, because pacing oneself was for monks and poets, they'd plough ahead with roasts, sauces thickened with breadcrumbs, pies encased in pastry too tough to eat, called coffins, by the way, because medieval food enjoyed a bit of theatrical morbidity. And once these savoury titans had been vanquished, the courses would keep coming. Sweet meats, cheese, spiced wine, rinse, repeat. This rhythm of eating, the idea of culinary sequence, of starting light-ish, scaling up to a densely flavoured climax, then winding down with sweets and cheeses, is something we've never really abandoned. The idea of a meal unfolding like a story, with chapters, drama, even a surprise plot twist in the form of candied rose petals. Oh yes, those existed. And here comes another little leftover: table service. You know that moment in a nice restaurant when someone places your plate in front of you with surgical precision and says quietly, as if breaking a mystery, "The duck." That's a medieval echo. During great feasts, lords didn't serve themselves like mere beasts at a buffet. No. Pages and servants presented food using elaborate rituals. There was even a dedicated role called the carver, whose job was to artfully slice meat at the head of the table, often while performing silent acts of meaty theatre. And what about toasts? Those satisfying clinks of glass, usually involving someone mumbling something heartfelt about friendship, or accidentally quoting a Marvel movie. Toasting dates back to ancient customs, but it went full medieval during banquets where goblets were clinked and generosity boomed, partly to show cordial intent, and partly to prove the drink hadn't been poisoned. A useful tradition, though awkward at children's birthday parties. Then there's shared eating. Communal dishes. Picture the family-style dinner, the large dish in the center, the awkward moment when someone takes the last spoonful you were politely pretending not to want. This originates from the very medieval idea that large platters were meant to be shared by 2 or more guests. Individual plates weren't spoken of until much later. So yes, that moment of reaching for the central bowl is an ancient custom. Next time your cousin spears the last meatball, remember, you're participating in living history, whether you wanted to or not. Even the table itself has secrets. The medieval trencher, a thin slab of stale bread or wood that acted as a plate, gave way to our modern dishes, but the layout persists. Spoons to the right, bread to the left. Knife etiquette, passed down like heirlooms, even if your only heirloom is a lemon zester shaped like a chicken. And finally, perhaps most evocative of all, candlelight. Once a necessity, because feasting in the dark was a dicey gamble involving bones, spilled mead, and miffed minstrels, candlelight became synonymous with evening meals, and to this day it lingers. That warm flicker on a dinner table, a whisper of flickering history, or perhaps just a really fancy restaurant trying to hide the price of the wine. So here we are, many centuries later, still eating in courses, still toasting, still lighting candles, still arguing over the best way to carve a roast. The foods have changed, the sauces less likely to double as facial glue, but at heart, we are the same. Gatherers of chairs, pourers of drinks, hopers of dessert. Let the napkins be unfurled and the hedgehog-shaped marzipan admired, because one final morsel waits in the wings. And so, we find ourselves in the soft candlelit shimmer of history's dining room, standing over a table that never truly went away. It's set with linen dreams, wooden trenchers pretending to be plates, and modest goblets shimmering with yesterday's wine. You've dined through eel pies, discovered the strange persistence of spoons, and chewed through the meaty underpinnings of class politics via roast duck. But before we close the cookery scroll, there's still one lingering morsel on the table. It's called grace. Not the spiritual kind necessarily. Although yes, medieval meals often began with a flurry of bless us O Lord gestures that likely delayed dinner just long enough for the roast venison to congeal slightly. But I mean grace in the broader, medieval sense, the ceremony, the feeling of place. You might be surprised to know how much of that has stuck around. Modern-day table manners are, in many sleepy ways, just medieval muscle memory with nicer forks. Let's begin with the classics. Elbows off the table. A phrase whispered at dinner parties, shouted across Thanksgiving tables, and sternly enforced by grandmothers on 5 continents. But why? In the days when tables were literal boards laid across trestles, leaning on one side could tip the whole thing into disaster. That wasn't just clumsiness, that was peas and pigeon stews on someone's tunic, So yes, remove those elbows. It's not etiquette, it's furniture stability. Then there's the curious ceremony of hand washing. Medieval diners washed before meals not just once, not just twice, but as a full, high-drama prelude. Servers with long ewers and basins would sweep into the room, offering guests the chance to clean their hands publicly, often with fragrant herbs or warm water poured slowly while everyone watched. Sound familiar? Hand sanitizer at the restaurant entrance begins to feel oddly courtly, doesn't it? Now, about that odd thing you do when you pass the salt, and you do it, even if you don't realize it. You probably place it down in front of the other person, rather than hand it directly, right? That little pause, that distance, it's said to come, maybe apocryphally, from an old superstition about passing salt hand to hand being bad luck, possibly because Judas allegedly did it at the Last Supper. But even before that, salt was seriously symbolic. In medieval society, where you sat in relation to the salt cellar at a feast showed your rank. Those above the salt were the VIPs, their trenchers cleaner, their meats more tender. Those below the salt, well, they were likely to get whatever stew was left over from yesterday's feast. And if you've ever carefully watched where a napkin goes, you're participating in dinner theatre that goes back centuries. Medieval diners often wore their napkins, quite literally, either tucked into belts, draped over shoulders, or just flung somewhere confident. Lords had personal napkins, and probably someone else to carry them. Today's linen on your lap, just a domesticated version of a status symbol. There's also the ritual of toasting, a cheer, a clink, a smiling gaze around the table, perhaps followed by someone pretending their glass contains something classier than it does. This too has medieval roots. Toasting was deeply symbolic and sometimes suspicious. You toasted to show your drink wasn't poisoned, with clinking sometimes intended to mix the drink slightly, a symbolic demonstration of mutual trust. Of course, the clinking part escalated over the years, which is how glassware learned to fear weddings. Even the after-dinner lull, that moment when someone reaches for cheese or mince and conversation begins to dissolve like sugar in warm tea. That's strangely medieval too. Feasts were often followed by sweet courses designed to close the stomach. These weren't just desserts, but an early understanding of digestion, wrapped in honey and herbs. So if you've ever gone looking for a peppermint after dinner, you're following an ancient gastrological whisper. In the end, our kitchen habits are hand-me-downs, politely modernized and softened at the edges. We've replaced trenchers with porcelain, mead with mimosas, and salt rank with Instagram followers. But across the dining table of time, the essentials are still with us. To gather, to share, to pretend we know which fork goes first, to chew thoughtfully under twinkling light. And so, as the imagined firelight dances low and the castle shutters creak ever so gently in the nighttime breeze, we close the great hall's doors softly. The feast is over, the customs carried forward. Good night, traveller. Sleep well with crumbs of history still warm in your dream pocket.